Welcome, welcome. I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm Newcomb Stillwell. I'm the chairman of the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm very happy to welcome everyone who's here in person and all the hundreds who are out there in the ether watching us on the internet. You have to bear with me a little bit. I'm neglected to bring my reading glasses. So this evening, we will welcome David Waldstreicher and Kellie Carter-Jackson, both of whom are longstanding friends of the MHS, have been here many times, and we're glad to have them back. We'll be discussing Dr. Waldstreicher's latest book, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley. We have the biggest Phillis Wheatley collection in the world, so we're very excited for this conversation. The book has received wonderful reviews. Another friend of the MHS, Carrie Greenidge, in the New York Times book review said, the Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley is at once historical biography at its best and literary analysis at its sharpest. Now, it's kind of hard to top that, don't you think? So, David is a distinguished professor of history at the SUNY Graduate Center. He is a historian of early and 19th century America with particular interests in political history, cultural history, slavery and anti-slavery, and print culture. Kellie is the Michael and Denise Kellen Associate Professor of Americana Studies at Wellesley. Her research focuses on slavery and the abolitionists, violence as political discourse, historical film, and Black women's history. For any of you who may be joining us here for the first time, we're the oldest historical society in the country. We've been collecting for 232 years. We're one of two or three of the most important archives of American historical materials. We have over 14 million manuscript pages, and we make this collection available to researchers and scholars and the public free of charge. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors, and we hope you'll come back, and we hope you'll join as a member and help us support this wonderful work and great speakers like this. So with that, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you for being here.
One more time. Good evening. Oh, I like that. Okay. I am so excited to be here tonight. I've not seen my good friend David in a long time. The pandemic has caused a lot of separation. But to be able to come back together again to talk about your book on Phillis Wheatley brings me so much joy. So I want to thank you for this invitation. I'm honored by it. And I want to dive into your book. I have a bunch of questions. We were going to leave time for Q&A at the end as well. And I want to first start out by saying like how I sort of came to Phillis Wheatley. I make a joke in a lot of my speeches and a lot of my classrooms that most students only know like 2 Black people per century. And I start out in the 18th century, it's Phillis Wheatley and it's Crispus Attucks, sort of the first Black woman poet and, the first casualty of the American Revolution. And then how in the 19th century, it's like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks and King. Like it just becomes about one great Black man and one great Black woman. We know that they existed, but seldom when I push beyond the name and I say, well, who is Phillis Wheatley? What did she do? Students are kind of like, she wrote something. And, that becomes like the extent of it. And I don't think we realize just how monumental her presence is, both in history and in literature. I just learned tonight through Dr. Russell that Phillis Wheatley is the most memorialized person in all of the 19th century, which I think is huge. And so I wanted to just open up with just a few quick thoughts and then open it up for questions. Is that okay? Okay. So I was reading the scholar Linda Kerber, who debuted her seminal collection of essays entitled Toward an Intellectual History of Women. It was an anthology that addressed the role of women in early American history and examined the significant ways in which gender is central to our understanding of intellectual and cultural history. While the study of intellectual history often lends itself to a discussion of men and their production of ideas, Kerber's work was and is seen as groundbreaking. However, nowhere in her book are the contributions of Black women discussed or featured. As historians, we understand very early in our career that forgetting is political. Forgetting is political. There is a grave danger in pushing the work and production and ideas of Black women, not merely to the sidelines or to the footnotes, but to oblivion, spaces where the world operates as though their thoughts, ideas, and experiences do not exist. In the words of the late historian Stephanie Camp, Black women's history doesn't merely add to what we know. It changes what we know and how we know it. Thanks to the work of David Waldstreicher, Black women, such as Phillis Wheatley, have a voice. Ideas and biography matter. The lives and experiences of Black women in the 18th century and during the American Revolution matter deeply. I've always understood Phillis Wheatley as a public intellectual, that Wheatley's poetry and her ability to speak to the larger political atmosphere is perhaps the best example of a Black public intellectual during her time. Not only was Wheatley immensely popular among her Boston community and as a woman, she spoke about the moral failings of slave masters. And in the literary world, she challenged the perceptions of what it meant to be both Black and a woman while writing some of the most provocative pieces of prose. Wheatley had an opinion and a voice to have her ideas and her sentiments heard, regardless of how they were received. This reframing of Wheatley is an exceptional way of placing a Black woman at the center of a colonial era rife with the thoughts of elite white men. Waldstreicher says that what excites you the most about Wheatley is not the answers she offered, but the questions she posed. And I could not agree more. I'm thrilled by the work that is being done by David, and I have no doubt that it will continue to confront and create new and necessary scholarship. So bravo, David. First, I want to know if you can talk about the origins of this project. I love origin stories. And I want to know how you came to Phillis Wheatley and if you could talk about really the genre of biography, because if you've been paying attention to the landscape lately, there's a lot of new biographies that are coming out. Carrie Greenwich just did the Grimkeys. I'm reading a new biography on Samuel Ward that's set to come out soon. Recently, we've had like revisitations of people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And I wonder if you can talk about why biographies matter, why stories like this matter, and what should we know about the life of Phillis Wheatley, the life and poetry of Phillis Wheatley. Sorry, that's a lot in one, in one shot.
Oh, I'm afraid to start talking about the origins of this book and that I'll never stop because it took so long and because it's not easy to write a real biography of someone who didn't leave the usual trove of documents, diaries, and letters. We have about 12.5 letters from Wheatley, and we have her poems. And that's until Vin Coretta did his biography in 2011, it was considered basically impossible to write a biography, but of Wheatley or someone like her. So it means looking for a lot of footprints, a lot of places where she interacted with people and they commented on her or they left evidence that can be interpreted about their interactions. But early on, I realized that Wheatley's work is in her poems, and yet scholars, despite all the wonderful literary criticism that had been done and some good work by historians, mostly in essays, a little burst of it in the 70s, and then by David Grimstead, and then wonderfully historically grounded work by literary scholars more recently. Really, folks had not looked at her poems as things that happened in a particular place and time. And when I mean particular place and time, I don't mean Boston in the Revolutionary era. I mean this poem in July of 1769, given in manuscript to these people or published in this venue. they hadn't really seen her poems as actions by someone who knew their audiences and was very widely read and understood the complicated politics of what it meant for a Black woman to be writing neoclassical poetry and Christian evangelical poetry, and in several genres. And so it took a long time to understand her various cultural contexts and also try to place them back into the world that she's experiencing, and to try to understand and depict her poems as actions that are interesting, but also then the best evidence that we have for what she's thinking and feeling and doing. So I'm interpreting the poems, but I'm also using the poems to say, these are the best clues we had into what she's up to. And they change her life. So it really is it really is a biography in that sense. So I try to move back and forth from the writing and the context and to what she's doing. I think for some readers, it will be surprising how little of her and how much of a lot of other people are on the page. And I don't want to pretend that that's not the case. And one reviewer, of course, I'm like every author, I'm focusing on the criticism, right? Already. Well, I knew this was going to happen, but I couldn't help but be struck. There's one reviewer who sort of said at the end, now we really need a novelist to tell the real story of Phillis Wheatley. And I'm like, okay, okay, so there's this desire to get inside the person's head. I was like, okay, she wrote poems. How much more inside a person's head can we get than with a poet looking at her poems? If she had a diary, would that be more revealing? Not necessarily. No, People perform in their diaries as well, and they're also have an imaginary audience. Yeah. So it took a lot. So I like to think that I was the right person to do this because I'm a historian of the Revolutionary Era and a historian of slavery and anti-slavery, as you heard, but also because I was an aspiring poet at one time in my youth, and because I have a BA in English and my PhD is in American Studies, and I like literary studies and I care about it, and I kept reading in it. So so in part, this book comes out of my desire to get back to the story of African Americans in the American Revolution with African Americans at the center, as opposed to my books about Franklin and slavery, where Franklin ran away with my book that was going to be about fugitive slaves and print culture, and it became a book about Franklin. Then I wrote a book about slavery and the Constitution, and found it really impossible to have any Black voices in it until the epilogue. Really, I wanted to do something that had Black voices in it, and that was more direct about that. And I had been fascinated by Wheatley, both as a teacher and as she came up in my earlier work, and I had a little bit about her in my first book about celebrations and politics, and then I had a little bit about her in my book on Franklin, where she has an interesting interaction with Franklin while she's in London. And so, but it took a long time to figure out how to turn it into a story, and frankly, to try to have it be the kind of to address the issues that I wanted to address about how we think about the relationship between African Americans and the Revolution, and slavery and anti-slavery.
It's so funny. If I can push back against the criticism, when I think about Erica Dunbar's book, Never Caught, on the life of Ona Judge, she takes just 2 interviews that Ona Judge gave in her entire life and writes a whole book about her life. And you're like, how do you write a whole book based off 2 interviews? Or how do you write a whole biography based off a handful of poetry and, articles or certain, people speaking about her? But I think that is the real hard work of the historian, is that we can tell these stories. We can pull these larger narratives about what's happening in the larger world. And then even in a contemporary sense, I tell my students who are obsessed with Beyonce that like she never gives interviews. Everything's in her songs. Everything's in her music. You listen to a Beyonce song, she told you about her marriage. She told you about her children right there in that song. And I think it's sort of the same thing with Phillis Wheatley as well. We're getting a lot of who she is in her poetry. And I don't know if you can, when I come to think about Phillis Wheatley, when I first came to her, I realized that her life was one of, immense tragedy. When you think about the fact that she is, kidnapped as a child, brought from Africa, endures the Middle Passage, is enslaved most of her life, but gifted and talented, and people can recognize that. But her life is cut short. She only lives to the age of 30, 31. She has 3 children. All of them die. She gets married. Her husband's poor. They live a life of poverty. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this woman has such a hard life. And yet she's able to write these pieces of poetry that have presidents and founding fathers grappling with her ideas. Can you speak about like just the remarkable history that is Phillis Wheatley?
I think that there's a tendency to there's been a tendency to stress the tragedy of her early death and the fact that she wrote a lot of poems that we will never see. And she had a second book manuscript, and we only have a few of the poems that would have been in there. So so there's been a tendency to stress the tragedy and what might have been, and I put more emphasis quite deliberately on how does she become who she is? How does she become the most famous African of the 18th century? Most famous in North America and in Europe. She's and this took a long time to figure out how I wanted to begin the story and not project our assumptions about many other things onto it. But I think it's entirely possible that she had a cosmopolitan experience before she gets to Boston. We're talking about someone who learned so much so quickly, is clearly a genius and a prodigy. One of these kids who could, we've all seen the movie, right, about these people in the 20th century who go to college when they're 12 years old and then don't live happily ever after and all that, right? Yeah. She's one of them, and she manages to charm people and be recognized sufficiently to gradually do something that everyone would have thought is impossible. And I don't mean just the learning English and writing what she's writing, but also getting it published and getting recognition for it and becoming famous, which she already is in 1770 when she's 16, 17 years old. Internationally famous. She writes the best poem about George Whitefield, who is the great evangelist of the time, who's crisscrossed the Atlantic 6 times. They can't get enough of him here. He's, and she knows exactly what she's doing because Whitefield has brought over the Mohegan missionary Samson Occam to raise money for evangelical projects in North America. And she's Mrs. Wheatley is at the center of these things. And she's seeing all this. And Whitefield and Occam are in the house. And she writes a letter that gets to one of her first writings, John Wheatley says, is a letter to Reverend Occam while he's over in England. So here I am, I'm telling the whole story about how she got famous. But so we tend to zero in on this moment. Well, they published her book and then things didn't work out. Like, no, this is an 8-year campaign that from the time she is strategizing and getting this done, like while she is a child, while she is a teenager, setting herself up to get her book published, which which we're not sure exactly how it happened, but one way or another, it makes her free. And everyone can see, not everyone, a lot of people can see that this book and her existence makes the argument that there's something deeply wrong about African slavery and the way it works. And only more so because of all this talk about freedom that's going on by the time we get to 1773. So that she is at the center of a number of controversies and a number of things that are going on, and it's incredible how much she makes of it, and the life that she makes out of it. But what does she do with it? Well, if we say it's a tragedy and she's going to die young, then we're fast forwarding. What she does make of it is she's trying to sell her book, having some success. She comes back to Boston, like a lot of some refugee people do, but a lot of people don't. She gets married and starts a family. What does that tell us that she was trying to do? What is that? And like, shouldn't we celebrate that? Yeah. You know, and maybe sort of, she doesn't know how it's going to all end up, right? Yeah. Right. So I don't so that's why I don't mention it, and maybe to a fault, but I don't dwell on it because I want us to understand what the decisions she's making as she's making them, even though she knows the odds are not in her favor.
Yeah. I mean, to me, who she chooses to marry and how her marriage, I imagine someone of her youth and beauty and intellect could have married anybody. She could have, married up, as they say. And that doesn't happen. She marries someone who is poor. And I wonder how calculating is she in thinking about her long-term life? I mean,
can I push back a little bit? Sure. I think John Peters is actually the best, a really good prospect. He's doing well. He's really impressive. Mm-hmm. And he's trading. He's making money. They live in a according to the tax records, the house they live in at one point is fairly substantial. And then they move it. Then they go out to this farm that he might inherit and that he's taken care of. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work out. And Nina Dayton has told this story amazingly, finding all these records. But like she basically has real estate problems, like a lot of people do, like a lot of Black people do.
Yes.
Trouble with the neighbors, right?
Yes.
Like it's all too familiar.
Yes,
right?
It is.
So, but I don't think she made a mistake. And the white Wheatleys in later generations, and maybe Obor Tanner too, and as told to, we don't know for sure, suggested, maybe she married the wrong guy. But it's all kind of like things don't work out and the marriage was a mistake. We've heard that story before. That's sort of how I see it. So I actually I think that what could be more Yankee American than us saying that because they ended up poor, it must have been a mistake. I'm sensitive to this because of all the time I spent with Ben Franklin, and how everybody in Ben Franklin's life who didn't he's trying to help people do as he did, but when it doesn't work out, he's pretty judgmental. Yeah. It suggests there's something wrong with the system, and the system has produced him, so it can't be that bad, right? It's the liberal dilemma, basically.
Yes.
So that's I think the Wheatleys, the John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters got some of that, experienced some of that condescension, and I think it's still in the scholarship. So I try to push back on that, but I have actually a strategy about some of the stuff I don't agree with. And I kind of leave it in the footnotes, and I don't acknowledge I don't acknowledge some of these myths, these stories about Wheatley that I don't believe in. I feel like, okay, I did my homework. I'm just telling the story as I see it, and I put the other stuff in the footnotes. And I'm not saying he wasn't a bad guy. Really. She didn't marry the wrong guy. I don't say it explicitly, so one might miss it. But I actually think she made a good choice. But maybe I'm just a defensive man.
No, I love that. I love when people push back. And I mean, you can tell that you are close to your subject and that you care very deeply about telling her story. I wonder, as a historian, I think we're given a set of skills and tools for how to sort of craft these narratives. But because you're spending so much of the time really deconstructing her poetry as well, I guess, can you talk about the ways that history, in some ways, is perhaps insufficient to tell a complete story of a person, that your literary tools and what it means to examine a poem and then reap something from that poem really is where, as Kellie Gunter says, some of the strongest, most poignant analysis is the poetry. And I want to know if you can talk about like how sometimes we need more than just the tools of history to tell a story. Especially, I say this because I'm in Africana studies, and so we're interdisciplinary, and we're always pulling on art, or we're pulling on poetry, or we're pulling on, different aspects to give you the fullest portrait of a person.
Well, I try to signal where I'm getting stuff from, and I got a lot of help with the poetry from a lot of very brilliant people who have been writing about Wheatley and who figured out how interesting she is. And I'm not alone in that. The recent scholarship, I could start mentioning names. I'm afraid I'd leave people out, but like so much of it is stunning. So I benefited from that, and here it may have even helped to take a long time with the book. So I don't want to take complete credit. It's all in the footnotes, and when I'm reading a certain poem and when I'm influenced by somebody else's reading, I try to make that clear.
Yeah.
But I do. It's an interdisciplinary book, but I don't. It's one of the things that was really kind of a through line for me, and as a reader of history, is that I started my interest in history comes out of reading biographies as a youngster, and we were all discouraged from. It was very clear that when we went to grad school that you don't write a biography for your dissertation, right? And that unless you find a treasure trove of stuff about someone really interesting that nobody has even written about, and that so rarely happens, it's very hard. It's very hard to do, and so I never even thought about doing it. But I never lost my sense that that biography can be not just excellent history and revealing history, but it can also interact productively with different fields and subfields in history, and that's a sort of a very, it's an interesting so what does a biography of a politician look like? What's a political biography? What's a cultural biography that tries to set someone in cultural context? What are the burdens of a literary biography when you're writing about a writer? What are the particular burdens of biography for African Americans in a situation in this culture, in this place at this time, but also given, as scholars have been talking about a lot recently, the way the archive is especially biased against Black women.
Yeah.
And so this is like, so I feel like I'm looking at the things that people have been saying about archives. I've been it's all over this project.
Yeah.
And yet not, because the particular traces in the archive are all about her being an exceptional Black woman who people wanted to figure out and deal with. So I think that sometimes biography proves to be the best way to get at George Washington and slavery, for example, in Erica Dunbar's book. I want to say the full name so that in case you guys don't know.
Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Yes,
right?
Yes.
I had good mentors and encouragement with this. In Alfred Young, for example, who was very encouraging about this project, and told me that he thought I might be the right person to do this right, which meant a lot to me, because I worked on Franklin, but I wasn't really a Boston historian. In a direct way, writing about it as a place and writing about people who spent their lives in it until this project. So I was a little, given how many good Boston historians there are and what a wonderful literature there is going back so long, I was a little bit gun shy, and to have his blessing in that, as in other ways, was very important to me.
Yeah. I love that this is a biography. I love that this is a story of Phillis Wheatley and her poetry. I love the fact that the Odyssey too is also, I think, something that's really important. You get to see sort of her journey. I've been in conversation with other scholars about biography because I feel like there's so few biographies, particularly of Black women. I learned recently that there's like no biography of Coretta Scott King. There's no biography of like Black Panther women. There's very few biographies of Harriet Tubman. There's a couple. They're a little dated, that we are constantly in need of recuperating the lives of people who should have center stage. And then you go to look for their biographies and there's not a lot of them there. I think biographies are political too, right? Like who gets to have a biography tells you that they have to be significant or noteworthy. But also I'm thinking about just sort of, if you could speak to, is there a particular writing or piece of poetry that spoke to you the most about Phillis Wheatley, or you feel maybe surprised you or stunned you? I know that I'm good friends with Tara Bynum, who writes about Phillis Wheatley as well. And she had an article that was titled like Phillis Wheatley Tells Jokes Too, or something like that. And it was all about how her poetry is kind of tongue in cheek, that she calls out, like the hypocrisy of race and the founding fathers in ways that you would miss if you weren't, trained to read deeply or in a particular kind of way. Do you think Wheatley is doing that too? Is there a poem that sticks out for you? And I love the way there's also all of her poems are included in the back. There's an appendix in the back of her poetry.
Well, the poems that are in the back are the ones that that I found in newspapers that I think need to be seriously considered to be hers, but we don't know for sure because they were published anonymously. Most women in the 18th century published anonymously, and we know that a few of her poems that we do know were hers because they're manuscripts, but they appeared without her name on them. So this is so I think it's something we need to consider. And so I put them in the story and argue that it makes sense that she would have written this poem at this time. It fits with everything else. It's not a major thing in the book. I kind of I don't think it's by far the really important original things in the book, but I put them there so that scholars and others can consider it. And it also fits with my argument about how ambitious she is and how she's experimenting in more genres and writing more, especially all these poems come from after her book, really, almost all of them. So I like some of those. I'm very excited about, and still feel like I'm still grappling with and figuring out. But there's one that is kind of drafty and doesn't get a lot of attention, and is sometimes been said to be unfinished. It's called America. That I think is particularly that I always come back to, and that's because I think it's a mini epic, or what they called an epillion in the 18th century. And it's here where it's one of the first places where you see her incredible ambition. She's taking on the American story. And really it's the New England story, but that's pretty much the same in the context she's writing and who she's writing to, and in that political context where the controversies are going on in Boston in 1768. And this is particularly important. It's particularly important to me to see Phillis Wheatley as, okay, she's taking on Christianity, she's taking on Boston, she's taking on the imperial crisis, she's taking on American identity early on as others are beginning to say, what does it mean to talk about America? Where does America stand in relation to Britain? Where does America stand in relation to the nations? Where does America stand in relation to history? And maybe it's because I'm a historian of nationalism. That's what I wrote my first book about, is I think this is particularly bold and important. And my point of entry with Wheatley, at least as a scholar, though not as a student, was that, okay, it's not just that okay, she's an enslaved person writing poetry, and this has huge implications. And there are lots of ways that she's addressing these questions about what it means for Africans to be converted, and whether what slavery might be, and what Africa might mean, and what does she mean by Africa when she invokes it, and maybe we'll get to that. but that while she's at the very moment that she's dealing with all that, she chooses to say, this question about America is important, and it's important to me, and it might have implications. Is America a place where things get better? Or is America a place where things get worse? Is it this barbaric place? Is the question that she comes back to later on when there's this controversy going on about freedom and slavery going on. And that's the poem where she's entertaining this and saying, oh, the British are treating us this way, and America is being treated as a child and not being treated right by its parent, the king, the queen. That's the poem in which she said, in which we have this line, which I think is what she's all about. Sometimes by simile, a victory is won. And so that's where she makes the connection. That's where she says, writing is fighting, and can be for me. But it wasn't until I was doing revisions on the book that I actually did my homework on simile and realized that there's a debate about simile among neoclassical poets. Alexander Pope in the Odyssey, and I talk a lot about why she's so interested in this literature, that I say, well, she's interested in it because it's all about voyages, enslaved people, war, and women. All over Homer, Iliad, and Odyssey, all over a lot of this other literature. This stuff spoke to her. She could interact with it and talk about her experience in an indirect way. It's not the only thing she's doing, but it's an important thing she's doing that she hasn't gotten credit for. And it explains why it is she can feel like she can talk this talk. And it's not distant from her. It's not foreign, but actually enables her to say things she can't say directly and explore things. So that just as an aside. So, but simile, like a lot of the people who had criticized Homer and said, well, the Roman poets are better than Homer, right? Because his similes are savage. They compare things that shouldn't be compared. They're primitive. And Pope says in his footnotes to his amazing best-selling editions of the Iliad and Odyssey, he says, no, this is his brilliance. These similes are like, they're so original and they're so striking and they really get there. Like, he basically makes a historical argument. Like, this is where he's showing you, yes, they're savage. He's showing you that, like, there's a lot of savagery going on, and he's a poet and he's writing about it as he should. So so for her to not only say sometimes by simile a victory won, so she could have said sometimes by metaphor a victory won, or sometimes by poetry a victory won, or sometimes by language a victory won, or sometimes by ideas a victory won. Instead, she says simile. Why does she say simile? She's saying sometimes by doing this thing that is exactly what I am doing, like Homer did. Maybe I'm the new Homer. Maybe I'm going to tell this story that everybody is going to listen to and understand. And I can fulfill this role and have a victory at a time when which victory? The American political victory, or victory in the struggle against slavery, my own, or a larger one?
David.
That's what's going on. So that's why I like that poem, America, because boom, it's right there, right in the middle of it. And then she switches and starts to tell the story that is going to be the epic that she either shortens or never finishes. But
and that's really that's the last line of the book. So my advisor, Eric Poner, told me always read the last sentence in every book. It's like should be the most powerful line. But that's exactly what you talk about, how does the odyssey of her life and the afterlives converge in her prophecy that notwithstanding the modern Egyptians, there is a love of freedom. It spreads by simile. Its victories may yet be won. And it's just a powerful way, I think, of encapsulating what her work had the potential to do, what her ideas had the power to do. But I know we need to ask questions from the audience, but there's two things I want to ask you. One, I think I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Massachusetts Historical Society and the sources that you made use of. Like, can you share with the audience just what you made use of, how you found what was, super provocative or powerful for you, and how other people can use these sources to make sense of a larger historical moment or person?
Well, there are MHS, before any other institution, realized Wheatley's importance and got hold of the collection of her letters to Obor Tanner. And they're in the they were published in the Proceedings, volumes 7 and 8, 1863 to 64, and it was clearly the children of abolitionists in Boston understood her importance. Some of them had family connections to her, and they started to there were a few gifts of poems, and also they started to find them gradually. They were found in some of the big family collections. So there isn't like a separate sort of the papers of Phillis Wheatley that somebody gave to the society. But over the years, MHS has realized and created, in effect, an online archive of these connected things. But the fact that there are poems of hers in various collections is kind of the tip of an iceberg of relationships with Bostonians that I was very interested in, and that I tried to figure out who are these people who 100 years later that passed down one of Wheatley's poems and kept it in manuscript. Who is Hannah Mather Crocker? Turns out she's a contemporary of Wheatley who also wrote poetry and heard things about her, and that there are a lot of teenage white girls writing poetry and trading poetry. And these may have been some of the first people that she who recommended reading and who she shared poems with, right? So that's just one example. So there were other. MHS also enabled me to somewhat efficiently do deep dives with some of these people. For example, John Lathrop, who was one of the great Patriot ministers, but also one of these evangelicals involved in the Moores Indian Charity School with Samson Occam. And he married Mary Wheatley, the daughter of Susanna and John Wheatley, and knew her very well. But nobody had really followed up much on the role he plays. Clearly, there's some letters and evidence that he was encouraging to her. But I read his sermons. There are a lot of them. I can't say I read every word of every one. A lot of sermons, and his changing attitude about African Americans during the war was very revealing of the struggles that she had, because she actually goes to Providence during the war with Mary and John Lathrop. So she's clearly close to them. But by 1776, 77, 78, he is seeing Africans who he never said anything negative about that I know of before. He's seeing them as dangerous and potentially a fifth column. He's worried, as many patriots are, that the British are going to free slaves and the British are going to enlist slaves, and that they are basically a fifth column. Like Native Americans, even though they're fighting on both sides. And so even though Wheatley is clearly taking the Patriot side. So this is an example of what Wheatley was up against and how it's shifting and how it's changing and how she has to respond to that. So that's just that's an MHS example, but there are others that where like we haven't I feel like I had to study, if only because Wheatley studied these people, I had to study these people, and MHS was the best place for me to do that in many cases.
Shameless plug for MHS. Okay, I want to ask one more question before I turn it over. And this is a question that has sort of come into recent debate about how we use particular terms and pronouns to identify Black people. And Phillis Wheatley is in this unique space in that she is an African. She's born in Africa. We're not quite sure exactly which country. I believe it's either Gambia or Senegal or Senegambia, we'll just say, West Africa. But did you struggle with this over referring to her as African or Black or African American? Of course, there's recent debate about, are we capitalizing Black? Are we lowercasing Black? Like how we make sense of her identity within the current moment in which she's living, but also in our current moment in which we are living, and we are trying to grapple with how should we address people and what would be most appropriate. That's something I know I struggled with. Even in my current book, I'm like, am I capitalizing Black? Am I lowercasing Black? Like it becomes a real thing. And for this, I think it's even harder because African is another aspect in terms of how people are seeing themselves, especially people who are in the first generation of coming off slave ships. She's not, like second or third generation African American. She is coming straight off of the Middle Passage.
I did struggle with it. I don't know that I was waiting to see whether you would tell me if I got it right. I guess the the most important thing to me was that readers came away realizing that she's dealing with a racializing juggernaut, and where all the terms are politicized, and it's really not that much. It's just a different version of what we think of as a more recent phenomenon. And so I tried to call attention to her choices and the choices of people around her. I do strongly believe that she didn't believe in race in the way that and that I think that it's evidence of that she avoids using Black. She sometimes will use sable in a poem. And it's clearly a kind of literary device that others had used to refer to people of a darker hue. But why does she use it? Well, it does have those evocations of something elite and princely. So what I ended up concluding, and I have a little author's note on this in the beginning that which we decided to put in at the last minute to explain why I'm mostly not capitalizing, is that that she used African more than Black, and she avoided racializing words because she knew how they were being used, and she knew that it was increasing, and that it was a tool of the slaveholders. So I don't think she saw any. I don't feel like she needed to use the term Black to have solidarity with other Africans, which I see lots of instances of, I don't believe she was isolated. I don't believe she was rejecting her fellow Africans. I don't believe she was unconcerned with race and slavery. She just was wary of the way that she could not completely control the markers of identity in ways that shouldn't be surprising, that should be familiar. So I made the decision to not capitalize and to avoid using Black, and rather to use the language that she used, and to call attention to what she's doing when she's doing it. But then in the last chapter, when I'm talking about how she's remembered, and I'm talking about 20th century African Americans, and particularly writers who did use the term Black, then I start capitalizing, and that's what I explained in the beginning. But I'm not sure that who knows how whether this will seem right in 10 or 20 years.
No, I appreciated it. And here's why I appreciate it, because I think that we should sort of take people in the way that they want to be understood in the moment in which they're living. And I think had Phillis Wheatley come to the United States as an adult and could identify, I'm I'm Wolof or whatever it is, like had a very specific identity attached to her that children just don't have, maybe we would have a different perception of how she would want to be referred to. But I also think we're in a moment in which race is crystallizing, but there's clearly lines of blackness and whiteness, but in the way that we think of it today, it would not necessarily make sense for that moment. So I get it, but I still struggle with lowercasing and uppercasing. And am I reinforcing ideas about blackness that I don't want to perpetuate? It's something that I think about a lot. And maybe it's because I have Barbara Fields in my head and she's always like, black is an adjective. It's not a pronoun. And so I'm like, you wouldn't say two talls walk into a room, like that. You wouldn't describe people like that. But I digress. We have about 10 minutes left and I want to open it up to the audience for questions. I'm sure there'll be questions on Zoom as well. So if you could let me know, we'll try to get both the audience and the online audience too. But I see a hand right here. So let's just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Yes, thank you so much for this really engaging conversation. I'm looking forward to taking the Odyssey and exploring the work. My question is about her legacy. Do you think, or do you have a sense from what your research spoke to about how she envisioned her legacy? Did she think that we would be talking about her a couple centuries later? Did she talk about what her poetry might do even 50 years in the future? Anything attached to that would be really interesting to know. Thank you.
We don't, it's tough to answer because she died young and because we know so little about those last 6 years, what she was, where she landed on those questions, as it were. And being a first, you don't have a lot of models for what happens. Like, how is someone like me remembered? Well, if there's been no one like me, it's hard to answer. It's hard to answer. That said, I think baked into the very notion of poetry in the 18th century in ways that it's hard for us to realize that poetry could be both popular culture and held up as the highest intellectual or literary achievement, that it could be both those things at once. I think kind of baked into it is the possibility of aspiring to be remembered. And the way that some of the poets that she was reading, who were remembered thousands of years later, or hundreds or decades in the case of Milton or Pope or the other poets that she's reading, and they all write about this. There's a lot of it is very self-reflexive about like my. Thanks to you, my great patron, I'm going to live forever. I mean, that's the kind of like, that's the Horace and the other, they say things like that all the time. So she is, I think she's, I don't know that I would want to say that she's aiming that high, because then it would seem like, oh, well, maybe that was too high for her to reach. But I think she's aware of it as a possibility, and it shapes her very, very careful choices about what she will say and what she won't say. And it's we might if we can think more about what poetry was at that time, as well as what it is to us, and what we wish she did, which is like talk about her feelings like like the romantic poet that she was just on the verge of becoming, perhaps. Then we would have more patience with her, with how careful and studious she is, and not be as dismissive of it as we sometimes have been.
Next.
I was wondering if you had any insights as to how she decided on poetry as her genre of writing. It seems rather artsy, and you said she had experimented with other types of writing.
That's a great question. I have a couple of hypotheses or suggestions about that. One is, as I said, that poetry exists in a lot of genres in the 18th century. Some of them are quite popular and accessible. So, for example, some of her early poems I think, are clearly influenced by popular ballads and the kind of poetry, Isaac Watts, the kind of stuff that you would read and sing out in church. So it's very accessible, and it's like maybe it's the first thing that she really got to know. Also, a lot of school books, a lot of religious material was in verse. So it probably seemed a natural thing. But the thing that she says when she was asked about this, she says, we have something like an interview with her that a minister had said, "How did you get on to writing poems?" She says, "I read a play that was in verse, Rosamund by Joseph Addison." And the thing that's amazing about this, as I discussed, and nobody's really bothered to go. This is Vin Coretta, like nobody knew about this interview. Vin Coretta really brought it to the fore, but nobody's really like paid attention to this play by Addison, which is like, I don't know, the only word there is for it is, how do you pronounce it? Ribald. It's not the stuff of, it's not church stuff. It's like a light opera, and it's sexy. It's really like so. And I use this to argue. It's like, okay, so it's really like, this is like popular, exciting stuff. Like, she has an ear for popular culture, but also like the fact that there's a young woman character who like is getting hit on in this play. Like, maybe like she's a servant. Servants have to stay up at night, and they know what's going on with people and in a city, and like, she's aware that there are a range of things you can do with poetry, including plays and drama, and that it's not the narrow enterprise and even necessarily the artsy enterprise. That said, in 2 years, she's writing blank verse, which is very artsy, very Milton, very like, high end. So, maybe it's like, I don't know what could we compare it to today? Something that can go in multiple directions. Maybe that was part of the appeal of it, is that she could do different things in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hello. You said she had children. Could you tell me the gender of them? And since you also said about real estate issues or money issues, what was the husband inheriting, and how did he inherit it? Did she marry a white man or a black man?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to assume too much. No, he's black.
He's black.
Yes.
So how did he inherit it? I mean, like, because usually during that time, it's slavery. They don't inherit homes. I figure it's hard,
So my interpretation of what Nina Dayton has found, so he's involved in trade, and he has a white partner, and he does a bunch of jobs, and including representing people in court and himself. But he also he's in business. But so he grew up on this farm out in Essex County, and he's selling the stuff from the farm, and he has some relationship to the people who own the farm, and which he grew up on, and he's selling their stuff, and he's taking care of more and more stuff. The patriarch is very sick, and he's dying, and he comes back to live there, and he makes an arrangement with the widow and her disabled daughter that he will come to live on the farm, run the farm, and it seems clear that that it's kind of like a reverse mortgage, like, I'll take care of this for you, and then when eventually I'll inherit the farm. So I was shorthanding that's how I came to think of it as like a reverse mortgage situation, where he's not exploiting her. He's actually the solution to the problem that she has, that she doesn't have someone, she can't run the farm by herself and keep it solvent.
Yeah.
And with the children, we really don't know. It's all hearsay. We have some contradictory things, that she may have had 3. She definitely had at least 1. It may have been as many as 3. But it appears that they may have died with her. There's some testimony to that. There's some testimony or died in infancy. It's really unclear. We don't really know. There are none of the usual birth records. We don't know where they were born, and so it's very ambiguous. So I don't like to draw a lot of conclusions from that. On the one hand, mortality rates in New England are lower than a lot of the places in the world. On the other hand, it's still the 18th century and they're high. And we can't dismiss the fact that we say that she died starving in poverty, but we do definitely know that she had a severe asthmatic or tubercular condition. There are multiple references to her being sick at various points, and she did survive the Middle Passage. So we don't know the disease situation that she was dealing with.
I speculate that she probably suffered with health issues most of her life, and childbirth probably exploited those health issues. And even healthy women didn't often survive childbirth. So these are, again, speculations, but given all that she went through, it feels likely. Do we have time for one more question? One more question. That would be
I
great.
should mention that John Peters was in debtor's prison when she passed.
Yeah, that's right.
So there was which was very common at the time, and it's notoriously a time when people were trying to collect debts and putting people in prison desperately in order to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a question from online. Nancy asks, would you please speak to the value of her letters as another way into her thinking and her life?
Oh yeah, they're very interesting. They're beautiful. In cases, you really see that she was a prose stylist as well. And as Tara said, some of them are quite funny. And if you realize that she's sometimes sticking it to these ministers. That she's being very deferential toward, but actually revealing that as Hopkins wrote on his when he archived or buried or whatever when he saved her letter, says a very accomplished, I can't remember exactly what it was. She says a very impressive, accomplished person. She the letters they're in Vincent Coretta's edition of Complete Writings, and in some of the earlier ones, so they're not that hard to find, and some of them are on the MHS website. But I definitely think that one should read them, and you do get a sense of her as a person,
personality.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us and the people online. And we have books for sale in the lobby, and I'm sure there are many other questions. I'm sure David would be happy to answer some of them while signing books.
Thank